The Perfect Trap, Operation Bolo, and the 12 Minutes That Changed Air War. Colonel Robin Olds gripped the stick of his F-4C Phantom as it screamed toward North Vietnam at 540 knots. Through the canopy, he could see nothing but clouds, a solid gray ceiling that stretched to every horizon. Behind him, in the Weapons Systems Officer seat, First Lieutenant Charles Clifton monitored the radar, watching for the enemy that Olds knew was coming. They were flying straight into a trap. The North Vietnamese had set it, prepared it, and were waiting for the Americans to blunder in. Surface-to-air missiles the size of telephone poles would rise through those clouds at any moment. MiG-21 interceptors were already scrambling from their bases, guided by Soviet radar systems that had been tracking the American formation since they crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. There was only one problem with the enemy's perfect ambush. Robin Olds had planned it. What the North Vietnamese didn't know, what they couldn't know until it was too late, was that the lumbering, bomb-heavy F-105 Thunderchiefs they thought they were attacking were actually nimble F-4 Phantoms carrying nothing but air-to-air missiles and enough fuel to stay and fight. The 12 minutes of combat that followed would decimate half of North Vietnam's MiG-21 fleet, ground their fighter force for 4 months, and prove that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't technology or firepower, it's deception. But on that gray afternoon of January 2, 1967, as Olds led his Phantom into the clouds over Phuc Yin Air Base, the outcome was far from certain. One miscalculation, one pilot breaking formation, one moment of hesitation, and Operation Bolo would become another footnote in the long list of failed missions over North Vietnam. The man flying into this calculated chaos was no stranger to aerial combat. At 44, Robin Olds was already a legend, a World War II ace who had shot down 12 German fighters over Europe more than 2 decades earlier. He should have been behind a desk in the Pentagon. Instead, he was leading the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, the Wolfpack, from the cockpit of a fighter jet, flying the most dangerous missions over the most heavily defended airspace in history. Olds had arrived at Ubon Air Base in Thailand in September 1966 to take command of a unit that was, in his words, not performing. The Wolfpack had become cautious, reactive, focused on survival rather than aggression. Losses to North Vietnamese MiG-21s were mounting. Morale was deteriorating. The fighter pilots of the 8th knew they were flying superior aircraft, but the rules of engagement, the predictable tactics, and the enemy's home field advantage were negating every technological edge the Americans possessed. Olds brought with him as his vice commander another legendary figure, Colonel Daniel "Chappie" James, one of the Tuskegee Airmen and a veteran combat pilot in his own right. Together, the command team that would become known as Black Man and Robin transformed the culture of the Wolfpack. They flew the dangerous missions themselves. They listened to their junior officers. They pushed back against the bureaucratic timidity that had infected American air operations over North Vietnam. And they watched, carefully, as the pattern of air combat revealed itself with mathematical precision. By late 1966, the pattern had become obvious to anyone paying attention. American fighter bombers flew the same routes, used the same radio frequencies, followed the same procedures. Soviet advisors and North Vietnamese intelligence analysts had become expert at identifying the heavily loaded F-105 thuds from the more dangerous F-4 Phantoms just by listening to their radio chatter and tracking their radar signatures. The MiG-21s would wait until the American formations were committed to their bombing runs, then strike with devastating hit-and-run attacks. The supersonic Soviet-built interceptors would slash through the formations, fire their missiles, and vanish back to their bases before the American fighters could respond. And under the rules of engagement that governed American operations, those bases were untouchable, political sanctuaries that rendered pursuit impossible. The Americans were flying into an ambush every single day, and everyone knew it. The question was, could you turn an enemy's ambush into a trap of your own? Olds began working on the answer with his operations officer, Captain John J.B. Stone. What emerged was audacious in its simplicity. Make the F-4 Phantoms look exactly like F-105. Fly the same routes, use the same call signs, match the same speeds and altitudes, even carry the electronic countermeasure pods that the F-105s used. Create a formation that would look, sound, and behave exactly like a vulnerable bombing strike. Then wait for the MiGs to take the bait. The key to the deception was attention to every detail. The F-4s would fly at 540 knots, the speed of a fully loaded Thunderchief, not the faster pace a Phantom would normally maintain. They would use F-105 radio frequencies and call signs. They would carry the QRC-160 jamming pods that were standard equipment on F-105s but that F-4s rarely used. They would even simulate the ingress pattern of a typical bombing mission, approaching from the west as strike packages always did. But instead of bombs, each Phantom would carry 4 AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles and 4 AI-9 Sidewinder heat-seekers. Instead of being loaded down with 6 tons of ordnance, they would be light, agile, and ready for a sustained dogfight. The plan required perfect coordination. While Olds led the main force in from the west, mimicking the F-105 strike package, additional F-4 flights from the 366 Tactical Fighter Wing would come in from the east to block escape routes and prevent the MiGs from landing at their bases. If the weather cooperated, if the timing held, if the North Vietnamese took the bait, the Americans would have the MiGs trapped in a killing box with nowhere to run and no safe haven to retreat to. If any of those elements failed, the deception would collapse. The Phantoms would be exposed over the most heavily defended real estate on Earth, with surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and enemy fighters all converging on their position. It would be a massacre. Olds named the Operation Bolo after the Filipino fighting knife, small, simple, deadly, and completely unexpected. Until it was too late. The mission was scheduled for January 1, 1967, but weather forced a delay. The next day, January 2nd, conditions were barely better. Heavy clouds still covered North Vietnam, but Olds decided they couldn't wait any longer. The longer they delayed, the more likely the North Vietnamese would detect something unusual in the American preparations. 7 flights of F-4 Phantoms launched from Ubon that afternoon. The lead flights carried the call signs that would become legend. Olds Flight, led by the Colonel himself. Ford Flight, led by Chappie James. Rambler Flight, led by Captain Stone. Behind them came Lincoln, Tempest, Plymouth, and Vespa flights. In total, 48 Phantoms headed north, every one of them flying the profile of a fighter bomber that planned to hit targets around Hanoi and return to base. As the formation crossed into North Vietnamese airspace and headed for Phu Quien Air Base, Soviet-built radar stations tracked their approach. Intelligence analysts listened to the radio traffic, confirmed the call signs, noted the speeds and altitudes. Everything matched the profile of an F-105 strike package. The controllers at Phu Quien scrambled their interceptors. Between 11 and 14 MiG-21s rose through the clouds, their pilots confident they were about to bounce a formation of heavily laden bombers that would be all but defenseless against their superior speed and maneuverability. At 3 p.m. local time, Olds' flight arrived over the target area. The clouds were so thick that Olds could barely see his own wingmen, let alone the ground below or the enemy fighters that were vectoring toward him. For a moment, it seemed the weather might ruin everything. The MiGs might never find them in the soup, or worse, might stumble into them with all the advantage of surprise. Then the MiG-21s came boiling up through the clouds. The first indication was a flash of silver, a delta wing shape that materialized out of the gray mist and shot past Olds' Phantom. Then another. Then suddenly the sky was full of them, MiG-21s everywhere, their pilots realizing too late that these weren't the slow, vulnerable Thunderchiefs they had been promised. What happened next was chaos rendered into mathematics. 12 minutes of combat compressed into split-second decisions, aircraft turning inside their own length, missiles streaking through the clouds, and the oldest form of aerial warfare playing out at supersonic speeds. Olds spotted a MiG-21 turning hard below him, trying to get into position for a shot. The North Vietnamese pilot was good. He was using the MiG's superior turn rate to advantage, knowing that the heavier Phantom couldn't match him in a sustained turn. But Olds was better. He rolled inverted, using gravity to help his turn, holding his position while the MiG completed more of its circle. It was a maneuver that required perfect timing and complete confidence in both aircraft and pilot. I got on top of him and half upside down, hung there and waited for him to complete more of his turn, Olds would later recount. When the angle was right, when the geometry of the engagement lined up, he fired an AIM-9 Sidewinder. The heat-seeking missile tracked true, following the infrared signature of the MiG's engine. The explosion sent the North Vietnamese fighter tumbling toward the rice paddies below. Olds didn't wait to see if the pilot ejected. There were more MiGs in the fight, and hanging around to confirm a kill was a good way to become one yourself. Across the combat area, the other Phantom flights were engaging. In forward flight, Chappie James and his wingmen were mixing it up with their own group of MiGs. In Rambler flight, Captain Stone's pilots were scoring hits. The North Vietnamese pilots were skilled and aggressive, but they had been caught completely off guard. They had trained to fight F-105s, heavy, predictable, focused on getting to a target and getting home. Instead, they found themselves in a turning, twisting furball with F-4s that were lighter, fresher, and loaded for air combat. The MiG-21 pilots tried every tactic they knew. Some attempted to run for home, only to find more Phantoms blocking their escape routes. Some tried to dive for the safety of the lower altitudes where the thick anti-aircraft defenses would make the Americans think twice about pursuing. Some engaged directly, trusting their aircraft's superior maneuverability to save them in close combat. None of it worked. The trap had been set too perfectly, and now it was closing. Lieutenant Ralph Wetterhand, flying as Rambler 03, came face to face with a MiG-21 that popped out of the clouds directly in front of him. At that range, there was no time for fancy maneuvering, just point and shoot. His AIM-7 Sparrow hit the MiG head-on, and the enemy fighter disintegrated in a ball of flame. Major Philip Combes, flying as Rambler 01, used his radar to lock onto a MiG that was trying to escape into the cloud deck. The Sparrow missile, guided by the Phantom's powerful radar, followed the MiG through the clouds and found it. Another kill. Captain Everett Raspberry, in Olds flight, worked with his wingmen to trap a MiG-21 between them. When the North Vietnamese pilot broke toward Raspberry, trying to avoid the other Phantom, he flew directly into a Sidewinder shot. The missile tracked, hit, and the MiG became a fireball. In just 12 minutes of combat, the Americans claimed 7 MiG-21s destroyed and 2 more probables. The actual North Vietnamese records would later confirm 5 losses that day, with a 6th pilot forced to eject when his damaged aircraft ran out of fuel trying to make it home. By any measure, it was a devastating blow. Not a single American aircraft was lost, not one. The MiG-21s that survived the engagement limped back to their bases, their pilots shaken by an aerial ambush that had turned their own tactics against them. Among those shot down was Nguyen Van Cuc, who would later become one of North Vietnam's leading aces, but not before ejecting from his burning fighter over Phuoc Yin and parachuting to safety. Another pilot who survived his aircraft's destruction was Vu Ngoc Dinh, who would also become an ace in subsequent combat. For the North Vietnamese Air Force, January 2, 1967 was a catastrophe. They had lost half of their operational MiG-21 fleet in a single engagement. The survivors were scattered, demoralized, and uncertain whether the Americans would repeat the deception again the next day. Olds gave them no time to recover. On January 6th, just 4 days later, the Wolfpack flew another ruse, this time simulating an RF-4C reconnaissance mission. The North Vietnamese took the bait again, and 2 more MiG-21s were shot down. In 8 days, the Americans had destroyed or damaged more than half of North Vietnam's most advanced fighter force. The North Vietnamese grounded their remaining MiG-21s for 4 months, while Soviet advisors worked to develop new tactics and rebuild pilot confidence.
For those 4 months, American fighter bombers flew with dramatically reduced harassment from enemy interceptors. Olds' impact extended far beyond those 12 minutes of combat. For the first time in the war, American pilots had seized the initiative in aerial combat. They had dictated the terms of engagement, chosen the battlefield, and executed a plan that relied on thinking like the enemy, understanding what the North Vietnamese expected, and then exploiting those expectations ruthlessly.
The mission also validated Robin Olds' leadership philosophy. He had planned the mission, briefed it to his pilots with meticulous attention to detail, and then led it from the front, putting his own aircraft in the most dangerous position and trusting his people to execute their roles. The Wolfpack had become aggressive again, confident again, willing to take the fight to an enemy that had grown accustomed to holding the advantage. Olds would fly 152 combat missions in Vietnam, destroying 4 MiG fighters in aerial combat and earning the Air Force Cross for leading a strike against the heavily defended Paul Domer Bridge. He remained in command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing until September 1967, when his tour ended. His pilots carried him off the flight line after his final mission, a scene captured in photographs that became iconic images of the Vietnam Air War. In the years that followed, military historians and tacticians studied Operation Bolo as a masterclass in deception operations. The simplicity of the core concept, make your fighters look like bombers, belied the complexity of execution. Every detail had to be perfect. The timing had to be exact. The pilots had to maintain discipline even when flying into what they knew was an ambush. One mistake, one aircraft breaking formation too early, one radio transmission in the wrong voice, and the entire deception would collapse. The operation also represented something larger, proof that in warfare, the side with better technology doesn't always win. The F-4 Phantom was arguably the superior fighter, faster, with better weapons and more capable radar. But for months, the MiG-21s had been winning the engagement because they chose when and where to fight. Operation Bolo didn't change the technology, it changed the tactics. It changed who controlled the terms of combat. After the war, when American military leaders studied what went wrong in Vietnam and what went right, Operation Bolo stood out as an example of how to fight smart rather than just fighting hard. The lessons influenced the creation of the Navy's Fighter Weapons School, the famous Top Gun, and the Air Force's Fighter Weapons School. Both institutions emphasize tactics, aggression, and creative thinking over pure technological superiority. Chappie James went on to become the first African-American 4-star general in U.S. military history. Robin Olds became Commandant of Cadets at the Air Force Academy and later Director of Aerospace Safety before retiring as a Brigadier General in 1973. Both men's leadership during their time with the Wolfpack has been studied by military institutions for decades. The North Vietnamese perspective on Operation Bolo was more complex. They acknowledged the losses, but noted that their pilots had fought bravely against what they characterized as overwhelming numbers. They studied the American deception carefully and developed countermeasures. Better intelligence analysis, more varied tactics, closer coordination between ground controllers and pilots. When the MiG-21s returned to combat 4 months later, they were more cautious, more disciplined, but also more effective. One North Vietnamese pilot in an interview decades after the war described January 2, 1967 as the day they learned that the Americans were not just technologically superior, but could also think like fighters. It was, he said, a respect earned through combat, the hardest way to earn respect, but also the most lasting. For the pilots who flew Operation Bolo, the mission represented something personal. In a war where rules of engagement often prevented them from fighting effectively, where political considerations overruled tactical sense, where the enemy's bases were off limits and victory seemed deliberately out of reach, Bolo was a mission where they could fight on their own terms. No restrictions, no holding back, just fighters doing what fighters do, hunting the enemy and destroying him before he could destroy you. The statistical summary of Operation Bolo seems almost clinical.
7 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 probables, 0 friendly losses. Half of the enemy's advanced fighter force eliminated or damaged. 4 months of reduced enemy air activity. But statistics don't capture the psychological impact. The boost to American pilot morale, the shock to North Vietnamese confidence, the demonstration that American aviators could be just as cunning as they were technically proficient. The mission also carried a brutal truth that would echo through the rest of the war. When American forces were allowed to plan creatively, execute aggressively, and fight without crippling restrictions, they could achieve remarkable results. The problem was that such opportunities were rare. Political considerations, fear of escalation, concern about Chinese or Soviet intervention, all these factors combined to create an environment where tactical brilliance like Operation Bolo was the exception rather than the rule. In the decades since, Operation Bolo has been recreated in countless flight simulations, analyzed in military academies, and cited in discussions of aerial tactics and deception operations. The mission appears in films, books, and documentaries about the Vietnam War. Robin Olds became one of the most celebrated fighter pilots in American history, his handlebar mustache and aggressive leadership style making him an icon of the fighter pilot culture. But the men who flew the mission speak of it differently. For them, January 2, 1967 was a day when everything worked. The planning, the execution, the weather just good enough but bad enough to work in their favor, the enemy taking the bait exactly as predicted. In aerial combat, where split-second decisions separate victory from disaster, where mechanical failure or pilot error can mean death, where the enemy is skilled and motivated and fighting on his home ground, having everything work perfectly for 12 consecutive minutes is almost miraculous. They speak of the weight that lifted after those 12 minutes. Months of frustration, of watching friends shot down, of knowing the enemy held advantages that politics wouldn't let them counter, all of it released in a furious engagement where they finally held the upper hand. They speak of Robin Olds as a commander who understood what his pilots needed and gave it to them, a chance to fight smart, fight hard, and win decisively. The North Vietnamese rebuilt their MiG-21 force, developed new tactics, and returned to combat. American pilots would continue to face enemy fighters throughout the rest of the war. The air war over North Vietnam would go on for years, with victories and losses on both sides, with prisoners taken, heroes made, and tragedies accumulating until the whole painful conflict ground to its conclusion. But on that gray afternoon in January 1967, for 12 minutes over Phu Bien Air Base, Robin Olds and his Wolfpack executed the perfect trap. They proved that in aerial combat, the mind can be as deadly as the missile. They showed that deception, properly executed, can defeat even a prepared and well-positioned enemy. They demonstrated that leadership matters, that a commander who plans brilliantly, fights personally, and trusts his people can achieve results that no amount of technology can guarantee. The MiG-21s came up through the clouds expecting to find vulnerable bombers. Instead, they found phantoms loaded for air combat and pilots eager to fight. In the 12 minutes that followed, the course of the air war over Vietnam shifted. Not permanently. War is too complex and political considerations too dominant for any single mission to change everything. But decisively enough that everyone who flew that day, American and North Vietnamese alike, knew they had been part of something extraordinary. As Olds brought his Phantom back to U-Bahn that afternoon, one MiG-21 confirmed destroyed. The congratulations from his ground crew and fellow pilots had a quality beyond simple celebration. They were acknowledging not just a victory, but a validation, proof that American pilots could take control of a battle through cunning as well as courage, that the right plan executed at the right time could achieve more than months of conventional operations. The trap had worked perfectly. The bait had been taken, the killing box had closed, and for one brilliant, violent, perfectly executed mission, Robin Olds and his Wolfpack had shown the world what American fighter pilots could do when they were allowed to fight like fighters. That was Operation Bolo, a deception, an ambush, a massacre. and 12 minutes that changed how nations think about air combat.